Greetings. Today we want to look at the question of tribal economic thought, the earliest types of ideas that people had about the productive life around them. When we look at these societies, and we may be thinking about early the tribes of Gaul in Europe, or the Native American tribes in the U.S., or African communal societies long before the rape of Africa, we think about how did they live and what ideas did they have about the world around them. In general, there was very little documentation of their economic thinking. There's some archaeology that has shown us a few things, but not a lot of writing. In general, analytical thinking of any kind was really poorly developed at this time, but perhaps we can glean a few ideas from selections from the Bible, surprisingly. Most tribal societies, first of all, existed in a subsistence condition. That is, they were engaged with nature in order to make a living, you might say. But it was a very difficult living. They were subsistence societies. And generally, when you have that kind of society, there's not a surplus product that's generated in it, and as a result, people tend to be functioning together in a somewhat democratic social structure. That's not to say that there was no hierarchy and so on. There were chiefs and so on, and leaders and so on, but not the kind of economically exploitative conditions that we've come to assume in many cases exists today, or even in the last several hundred years. So really no materially privileged social class could really emerge. Hypothetically, if someone had tried to take away the subsistence from others, the whole tribe might die off, because the person who took it all would let the others end up starving. So it was sort of an unrealistic way of thinking about those societies. They were collective and tribal and working together to survive in a difficult environment. Most of the intellectual efforts that this tribal society made were fairly simple. They were trying to understand the weather, because that had a big effect on whether they could find food and so on. And just the basic physical conditions of existence were things they were looking for. Now, tribal society eventually broke down into class society in a rather complex process that had to do with the development of higher levels of productivity, ability to better control nature around them, and to be able to become more productive. And as surplus product emerges, various types of class societies emerge. Some were slave-based. Others were, such as those in feudal Europe or medieval Europe, were serf-based. That is, it wasn't exactly like slavery, and we can talk about some of that in class, and when we have that class coming up soon. And so we end up in these societies with a privileged class emerging to monopolize the surplus product of the society. Interestingly, this breakdown that occurs in tribal society led to resistance, unhappiness, concern from many of the people in the tribal structure who were finding themselves in the low end of the totem pole, so to speak. The tribal mores can therefore be gathered from the conservative critique of the emerging class societies, people who wanted to conserve the more egalitarian and collective society. Those forces were saying, no, we don't want to have this emerging class society. And so the spokespeople for these increasingly oppressed individuals revealed that there was economic exploitation in these new societies that were emerging. But these critiques were not analytical for the most part. They were subjective, moralistic statements. Perhaps the earliest one that we can find, at least in the Bible, is in Leviticus, and in the discussion of the year of Jubilee in chapter 25. There was opposition reflected in this section of the Old Testament to the unequal outcomes of economic processes among the tribal members themselves. Inequality that might be emerging as the tribal society was breaking down. It was to be remedied through the year of Jubilee, where every 50 years people were to return to the conditions that they had originally. And I provided you here in these slides with an example from Leviticus. In a sense, the year of Jubilee, the concept harkens back to a golden age of tribal equality that might well have been eroding among the tribes of Israel. And so you can read through this. I'll leave it up for a minute. but it basically says every 50 years we want to go back to where we were before. If someone has gotten rich, they should give it up, return property to others that they've taken it from, that if you become a slave, you should be returned to freedom, and so on. And there's a number of other points made throughout this section of Leviticus with the idea that you should not be exploiting others, and if some inequality has emerged, it should be reversed. So the moral imperatives of the year of Jubilee that were laid out in this discussion from Moses is that many of these characteristics of later societies, such as money and interest, enslavement for debt and private property, these things had begun to emerge out of the old tribal society, and it had emerged as real phenomena that were creating problems for the great majority of people in the early tribal structure. Class stratification was emerging, and this was a troubling process for a society that was used to a more egalitarian way of handling things. Now, if we look a little further in the Bible, we find that the monarchies of David and Solomon that happened in a few hundred years later from the time of Leviticus were very, very hierarchical and very exploitative. They made the pharaohs of Egypt look like, well, I guess the pharaohs of Egypt were pretty exploitative too, with their massive slave forces. But the tribes of Israel, which are in the narrative that we usually learn about that, the tribes themselves began to break down from being a more egalitarian collective group into a more a monarchy of David and Solomon, and they were based on the slavery of the non-Israelites, as indicated in 1 Kings chapter 5, where King Solomon raises a levy of forced labor out of Israel, and then he sent them to Lebanon, and so on and so forth. And these various slave laborers created the great temples that were so famous from the time of Solomon. And we go on to find out that, in fact, the people who were left after Israel had conquered the various areas, these various folks became slaves, and interestingly they say, and so they are to this day. Now, of course, this was written many years ago, but I think if we think about the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, these were all the people who today we might call Palestinians. And so today we find, in a kind of an echo of some of this, a very enslaved condition for the Palestinians under the sway of Israel. And so, anyway, so that's a little bit about that process. Now we want to take a look at what we learned from the protest against that. Again, no real analysis of the economic system in Leviticus or in 1 Kings, or even the books of the prophets that follow in the Old Testament. The prophets were wailing against the manifold injustices of the slave system with its impoverishment of the population, but they didn't really have a clear analysis. Amos, for example, in chapter 8, cries out, "Hear this, you who trample upon the needy and bring the poor of the land to an end. The Lord has sworn by the pride of Jacob, surely I will never forget any of their deeds." And he goes on to talk about all the terrible things that God is going to do because of the exploitation of the needy and the poor. But again, this is essentially empty threats of a moralizer who's shaking his fist at the rulers, but there's no real analysis of what could be done better. Isaiah, of course, has that famous prediction about how the ills of the nation of Israel will be corrected, and that, of course, is the prediction of the coming of Jesus and of Christ. So that's a prediction, of course, that people have often talked about as being, foreshadowing the actual arrival of Jesus. But there is no real economic analysis in that. And interestingly, I think Isaiah's prophecy of liberation is really only for Israel. and it's coupled with a prophecy of Israeli domination from Assyria to Egypt, and there was no liberation in Isaiah's prophecy for the non-Israeli slaves, which is a little different from what we usually associate with the role of Jesus in the opposition to Rome and the battles in the Middle East. So this is just a little bit of a flavor of what tribal societies were like, what their ideas were, and their limitations of their thinking in these areas. There's much moral prescription but little human progress and vision for the future in most tribal thinking about economic life. I look forward to seeing you in class. Goodbye.